This podcast is about the War of 1812, which is a forgotten war, but which was known as the Second War for Independence at the time that it took place. Every day at sporting events all across the country, Americans stand and sing every word of the national anthem, yet so few know anything about the war in which the lyrics of that song are about. The original poem was called The Defense of Fort McHenry and was written by a lawyer named Francis Scott Key during the Battle of Baltimore in 1814. Here's a picture of the flag that flew above Fort McHenry, the famous Star-Spangled Banner that Key wrote about while the British were bombarding the fort. The roots of the War of 1812 begin in 1803, when Britain and France resumed their war. This is part of what we now call the Napoleonic Wars that took place between 1803 and 1814. If you look, William Pitt represents the British on the left, Napoleon representing France on the right, and they're sitting at a table carving up the world for each other. When the two countries resumed their war, both nations imposed a blockade on each other. This was to deny trade with the United States. The United States was officially a neutral nation at the time. The British also continued their practice of impressment that we discussed earlier. This was kidnapping of American sailors and forcing them to serve in the Royal Navy. President Jefferson at the time enacted an embargo which prohibited all American ships from sailing to foreign ports. He hoped this would force an end to the blockades. It didn't. Instead, it crippled American exports in port cities that relied on shipping for their financial well-being. Here you see a ship town in New England. New England was greatly hurt by the embargo, and there was even talk of secession. The Embargo Act was extremely unpopular with most Americans. If you look at this cartoon, it's called Oh Grab Me, which is embargo spelled backwards, and you can see Jefferson sicking a turtle on a merchant who is trying to trade with the British ship you see in the background. In 1809, because of the unpopularity of the Embargo Act, Jefferson signed the Non-Intercourse Act. This banned trade only with Britain and France and reopened trade with the rest of the world. It also said that it would reopen trade with either nation that ended their blockade of American ships. In 1809, James Madison easily wins election in 1808 to become the new president of the United States and Jefferson's hand-picked successor. He was a distinguished legislator who struggled as an executive. Madison's policy was a bill known as Macon's Bill No. 2. It resumed trade with both Britain and France, but said that if either country lifted its blockade, the U.S. would reimpose an embargo on the other country. Since Britain was already dominating the seas, Napoleon took Madison up on his offer, and France ended its blockade. The British, on the other hand, increased their attacks on the U.S., leading Madison to declare an embargo against the British in 1812. The new Congress that met in 1811 was much different from previous Congresses. No longer was the old guard in power. Instead, new, young congressmen had been voted in from the South and from the West. Here you see two of the leaders of this new Congress that would become known as the War Hawks. Henry Clay was a congressman from Kentucky who would become Speaker of the House, and John C. Calhoun was a congressman from South Carolina. Both men are going to play an integral part in the years ahead. The young congressmen missed out on the American Revolution, and they wanted a war of their own against the British, just like their fathers had had. They were fed up with British impressment and blocking of American trade, and saw it as an insult to the United States that must be answered. They were also interested in territorial conquest. Indeed, the War Hawk motto was "On to Canada, on to Canada." And if you look at this map of the War of 1812, you see the green arrows. Those are U.S. offenses into Canada but they were both beaten back by the British. Southern war hawks were interested in acquiring Spanish-controlled Florida. This is because Spanish-controlled Florida had become a haven for fugitive slaves as a place to escape into freedom. The warhawks from the West were also interested in wiping out the Indian threat that pioneer settlers were facing in the wilderness of the West. Two Shawnee brothers named Tecumseh and the Prophet took a militant stand against these white intruders. They refused to sign treaties or work with the federal government. They called on Indians to give up textile clothing, stop drinking alcohol, and stop ceding lands to the whites. In 1810, Tecumseh begins leading attacks on frontier settlements. Warhawks in Congress become convinced that the British are behind these Indian attacks on the settlers, and they think that the British are giving the Indians money for scalps, as you see here in this political cartoon of the time, where the Indians are scalping the American in blue on the ground and then giving it to the British in the red coat. William Henry Harrison was the governor of Indiana Territory. He wanted Indiana to be entered into the Union as a state, but in order for this to happen, he would need to increase the number of white settlers to increase the population of his state. He felt that in order to do this, he needed to do away with the Indian threat that existed in Indiana Territory. Harrison gathered an army and attacked Tecumseh's headquarters at Tippecanoe River. Tecumseh was not there that day, but the Prophet was, and the Prophet and the Shawnee were defeated, and their village was burned. This victory made William Henry Harrison a national hero. Tecumseh joined forces with the British and fights alongside them until he's killed at the Battle of the Thames in 1813. Tecumseh's death brought about the end of any real chance of Indian unity in a fight against the white settlers in the West. In 1814, Andrew Jackson led American troops against Indians at Horseshoe Bend in current-day Alabama. This victory forces Indians to cede land in the southeast that would become the states of Mississippi and Alabama. If you look at this map of the War of 1812, if you look underneath the Great Lakes, you'll see Indiana Territory. You'll see a little star where the Battle of Tippecanoe took place. Remember, William Henry Harrison wanted Indiana Territory to be entered into the Union as a state. In order to do that, he needed to increase the white population, and he felt like he needed to do away with the Indian threat. If you look to the south, above Spanish Florida, you'll see the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, which took place in current-day Alabama, and the defeat at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend forces the Indians to cede land in the southeast that would become Alabama and Mississippi. These victories end Indian resistance to white settlers east of the Mississippi. When Congress declared war in 1812 against the British, we were a deeply divided country. The South and the West voted overwhelmingly for war, while the northern states, representing financiers and merchants, voted against the war. We were unprepared for war. We lacked a large army or navy. We had no national bank because the Bank of the United States charter had expired in 1811. And northern merchants and bankers who didn't want war with Britain in the first place refused to loan the federal government money. In 1814, the British invaded Washington, D.C. and burned federal buildings and forced the government, including President Madison, to flee. This is a picture of the executive building, which is now known as the White House, and it's a painting of what it looked like after the burning of Washington. This same painting actually hangs in the White House today. This is a painting showing the destruction of the Capitol building after the burning of D.C. The United States had very few victories in the War of 1812, and ultimately it would be events in Europe that would help the United States. Tsar Nicholas of Russia was threatened by Napoleon's army and didn't want his ally Britain to waste its strength in America, so he decided to play the role of mediator. If you look at this map, it's Europe during the Napoleonic Wars, and you can see all of the red land, orange land, yellow land, and pink land was land that was somehow controlled by Napoleon. And Nicholas was worried about Napoleon's army and knew that he would need Britain to help him. So US and British officials meet in the Belgian city of Ghent in 1814. At first, Britain had heavy demands, but then news came of American victories in New York and Baltimore. Also, the British were more interested with events in Europe and redrawing the map of Europe after the defeat of Napoleon. So the war basically ends in a draw. Both sides agree to stop fighting and restore conquered territories. The slogan in the United States becomes "Not 1 inch of territory ceded or lost." The most important battle of the war and the biggest American victory came after the signing of the Treaty of Ghent, when Andrew Jackson famously led American forces to repulse a British invasion of New Orleans. Back then, news took a long time to travel across the Atlantic Ocean. So even though the treaty had been signed to end the war, the Battle of New Orleans was still taking place. This victory at New Orleans makes Andrew Jackson a national hero and is going to propel him to the presidency. Also during this time, when the Treaty of Ghent is being signed and Jackson's defeating the British in New Orleans, Federalist representatives from New England states decide to meet in Hartford, Connecticut to discuss their grievances. There was even talk of some about seceding from the Union. And if you look at this political cartoon at the time, you'll see Federalists jumping off the cliff as England is standing with open arms waiting their Yankee boys to come back to England. The Hartford Convention, though, in their final document, did not ask for secession. The people who were talking of secession were a minority. The majority did not favor it. In the end, what they did ask for was financial compensation for money that was lost because of the embargo. They asked for an abolishment of the 3/5 clause of the Constitution, which counted slaves as 3/5 of the population and allowed the South to dominate the federal government. They also wanted a 1-term limit for the presidency, and they wanted a change to the Constitution that would call for a 2/3 vote in Congress for future embargoes, an admission of new states, and future declarations of war. Unfortunately for the Federalists, their demands reached Washington at the same time as news of the Treaty of Ghent and of Jackson's victory at the Battle of New Orleans. In this spirit of national unity and victory, the Federalist demands seemed petty and helped lead to the end of the Federalist Party. By 1820, the Federalist Party had all but disappeared, and the party of Washington, Hamilton, John Jay, John Adams, and John Marshall disappears from national politics.